You're listening to Soundrise Podcast, a show hosted by Aleks in Serbia and Vlada in Poland.
Each week we cover a different artist or band and engage in open spontaneous debates and discussions about specific parts of their discographies. Our goal is to expand their musical horizons and cover a great range of genres and styles.
Find us on Patreon, patreon.com/soundrisepod, and on social media @soundrisepod.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Soundrise Podcast. Hi Alex, how are you doing today?
Hello Vlada, afternoon to you. I was really looking forward to this weekend. Happy Easter everybody, and I'm also excited about this episode because we're today going to talk about a music genre that we haven't talked about in a while, and I think it is also something that me and Vlada have debates about, heated debates. So I'm really looking forward to it.
All right, I'm also very excited because today I decided to choose one of my favorite bands. It's not what I usually do. I usually try to choose someone I either like but I'm not very familiar with, or someone new. But this time I really wanted to talk about Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and I think I partly got inspired by Alex's post in our discussion group that you can find on Facebook, Soundrise Podcast discussion group. So please join the group. We need you. We need participants. We need people asking questions about music, debating music. We want to grow this group the same way we're growing our podcast. So check it out. And Alexander posted something about prog rock. Um, and Alexander, I think you have a somewhat ambivalent attitude towards prog. Am I wrong?
Yeah, you're kind of right actually. Here's the thing. So prog rock. The first time that I heard of prog rock was probably the band Tool, and I listened to some tracks by Tool, even some albums. I think the newest album, and I just never liked them. I just always, uh, I always find them kind of gimmicky, annoying, too pretentious, and I think it's kind of the case with their fans. I don't want to offend anyone, but it's just an impression, just like I did with the blues when we discussed Muddy
Please
Waters.
don't offend any fans, particularly if you have a prog fan as your co-host.
Yeah. So here's my general take on prog rock. I respect, their craft. I know that they are really good at what they're doing. They are fantastic instrumentalists. They are jazzers, and that says a lot. But on the other hand, I just can't get really in love with that kind of music. I never think of playing that music, on Spotify or somewhere else. I don't get inspired by it. I don't really discover a lot about prog rock, so I'm kind of, I don't know. There's some sort of distance between me and prog rock and prog music in general. I would say.
But if I remember correctly, when we did an episode of Vandergraaf Generator, you kind of liked some of this stuff. You thought it was pretty cool, if I remember
Yeah, I
correctly.
can. Yeah. There are some albums and tracks that I can like that sound really good to me, but the bottom line is that I would never, stick with it. That's the problem. That's the issue here.
Yeah, but the thing I wanted to convey also with today's episode is that when it comes to such a big genre as prog rock, we can't really paint all these bands with the same brush. I mean, you mentioned Tool, and now we're talking about Emerson, Lake and Palmer today, and I would say that these two bands are like incredibly different in many ways, even though they might have some kind of common denominators, mainly when it comes to their skill as musicians, experimentation with tempos, with more complex music forms. But musically speaking, it's like night and day, in my opinion. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, yes, I definitely would. But there is one common thing for all prog rock bands, I would say. It's, how they structure their songs. It's, the basic rule of prog rock, in my opinion, is that you have a lot of improvisations. You don't have this structure, the rhythm. It's not like, it's
They're very
definitely not.
structured, actually. They're very structured. Unlike jazz, for example, where you have a lot of improvisations, right, following the opening theme. Prog rock, for the most part, seems very structured, but it also allows for a lot of improvisation. That's my take.
I think, yeah, yeah, I kind of agree with you, but it's still different from your usual rock, pop tunes, punk, all these other genres that have a somewhat uniformed approach. Do you get what I mean? I mean, if you play
Yeah, I get.
a
It's more
typical punk song,
complex.
yeah,
It's
it's more
more
complex, and
complex.
for
It's
that reason, you just can't listen to it every day. That's probably
I mean, it
one of
depends
my
on the
biggest
listener.
takes.
I could possibly, I mean, I don't listen to prog every day, but I could imagine myself listening to nothing but prog for a month, and I'd have no problems with that.
Oh, goodness, goodness.
Okay, so let's share a few words about this monumental band that we're talking about today. So Emerson, Lake and Palmer uh, was considered to be a supergroup. And for those not familiar with that term, a supergroup means a band comprised of members, previous members of other well known acts and bands, right? So back in the late 60s, early 70s, there were a lot of supergroups forming. For example, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, right? All of these musicians were already acclaimed, already played in very successful acts. The same case is with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. So the band was primarily founded by Lake and Emerson. Greg Lake was initially the original singer of the one and only King Crimson, one of my favorite bands as well, and he was
And one of the most
masterful.
important prog bands, right?
Yes, definitely. Many say that it was King Crimson who basically invented prog. Now, there's a lot of debates about that, but many consider In the Court of the Crimson King to be the first real prog rock record, and Greg Lake was masterful on that record. His vocals, his bass playing, everything was just stunningly well performed. So it was a huge loss, a huge blow to King Crimson when he decided to leave the band. Um, he was unhappy with the band for some reason, probably some kind of interpersonal relations. And the thing was that the Nice, another good band, which had Keith Emerson on the keyboards, was touring at the same time as King Crimson. So they were touring together, and these two musicians had a lot of opportunities to bond and to play together. And when they tried to improvise, they noticed that they had a great chemistry between them. So they decided to form a new band, to leave their other bands and start something new, start a new project. So they needed one more guy. You know, they wanted to be a trio. At that time, power trios were quite popular, but they had a different idea of a trio, mainly a keyboard dominated trio as opposed to a guitar dominated power trio. So they tried to recruit drummers. It was very hard at the beginning. They wanted to get Mitch Mitchell from Jimi Hendrix Experience, another fantastic drummer, who I think at that time uh, the Jimi Hendrix Experience had just disbanded, so he was looking for a new gig. But for some reason, this never came to fruition. There was also some rumor that they were supposed to jam with Mitch Mitchell and Jimi Hendrix together and form a group with Jimi Hendrix. I don't know how that would come about, what that would look like. That sounds to me like a very weird combination, to be honest. Who knows? Perhaps it would have worked, but it never really came to fruition. And there were so many rumors about this. that, according to Greg Lake, were vastly exaggerated. So the band finally found Carl Palmer, who was suggested by somebody. But Carl Palmer at that time was the drummer of another great band called Atomic Rooster, and I have to say that you should all check out these bands, both the nice Atomic Rooster, of course, King Crimson. We don't need to say anything about that. It's one of the biggest bands of the 70s of the entire history of rock music, but maybe these other two bands are not so well known, particularly the Atomic Rooster. So check them out, especially if you like that kind of heavy, uh, early 70s, late 60s sound. You know, if you like the likes of Black Sabbath, for example, I think you will also enjoy Atomic Rooster. So, um, and we finally got this trio, three great musicians. At first, Palmer was hesitant to leave Atomic Rooster, but then after some persuasion, he realized that he had a great shot with these guys. And then they went on to record their debut record. And many people consider their debut alongside In the Court of the Crimson King to be basically the record that cemented prog rock on the scene, right? So the band went through a very fruitful period between 1970 and 1973-74. They released, I think, four studio records and two live albums, one of which is Pictures at the Exhibition, which could also be seen as a not as a studio record, but as a new original piece, because it was essentially their interpretation of Mussorgsky's Pictures at Exhibition, a great piece of classical music. But at some point, the band was so big and there was so much tension and pressure on them that they took a break, a 2 or 3 year break. And when they came back from that break, they were never quite the same. They never really recovered. They kind of meandered, and especially with the rise of punk music, they sort of lost their mojo. And there were also certain pressures on the part of the record company, Atlantic, at that time, that really killed off the band. Of course, later on, they had a couple of reunions, released another studio album in 1992, Black Moon, but it was these early years of the band that basically is all you need to know about them. Everything outside that, you can check it out, but I think it's not as essential. And this is the period that we're going to cover today. So, without any further ado, I would like to start with the debut record, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, so the self-titled record, recorded in 1970. And first, I want to hand the microphone to my friend Aleks. Aleks, I want to hear what you thought about this record.
Here we go. Yeah. First of all, thanks for that fantastic introduction. A really interesting story about this trio. And honestly, no surprise that they all used to play for some other bands, some other successful bands before joining this group. I mean, you can hear that on all of the records that we're going to discuss today, but no spoilers at this point. So this debut record was, surprisingly enough, quite enjoyable for me. So I have my notes, and I have to praise, first of all, the musicianship. Right from the get-go, you get to hear how fantastic their bass player is. The opening track, The Barbarian, it basically is a textbook example of a great bass player. And the one thing that sprang to my mind when I played the track is, oh, is this really 1970? You know, I know that you don't like this phrase, Vlada, but the track really sounded ahead of its time, and you can just tell that a lot of people, a lot of bassists, that is, would later be inspired by this
Oh,
track
I
and this
agree
album.
that what they were doing, sorry to interrupt you, but I agree that what they were doing at that time was ahead of its time, because they incorporated so many new elements into the existing um, existing templates of rock music, right? So I think you're right about that.
Yeah, so I was really, impressed with that, and the rest of the instruments as well. The keyboards were prominent, on this record, and you can just hear that on all the other tracks. But moving on, the second track, for example, has great keyboard work, and I just like there's this part around I think the fifth minute. So the track is called "Take a Pebble," and it's 12 minutes long. And somewhere around the fifth minute, you just hear this beautiful part with the guitar. It's kind of atmospheric, pretty simple. It slows things down, and towards the end of the track. I mean, this track is really special. It has so many layers that you can just enjoy it. You know, I think this might sound far fetched, but I think "Take a Pebble" could be an EP on itself.
Yeah,
With so many.
I'm so glad you singled out that track because I think it's my absolute favorite, not just on this record, but in their entire body of work. Um, I think it's for me. I know this is highly subjective, but this is one of the best tracks ever recorded. There's just something majestic about it. It is very reminiscent of the stuff on In the Court of the Crimson King, mainly because of Greg Lake. You know, the melody, there's this sense of an epic ballad. It's very dramatic, at the same time, very sophisticated. His vocal delivery is fantastic throughout the song. And you mentioned that beautiful part with the acoustic guitar. I just love that instrumental section, both with the piano and the acoustic guitar. And then there's that part where you hear hand claps, and that gives it a very lively atmosphere. It feels very real, very emotional, very. I'm
Kind
kind
of
of lost.
entertaining for the audience, right?
Yeah, I'm kind of lost for words how to describe this, but it feels like you're in the song. It feels like you're right there in some kind of tavern listening to the band. It's a
Emotionally
very
resonant.
yes, of course. It's a very vivid track in that sense. And I love that about it. Sometimes prog rock can sound very alienating, which I think is why you cannot get into some of the tracks or some of the bands. But in this case, it sounds very warm, very tangible. And that's what I love about this song. And everything is so subtle and beautiful. There's no access. The instrumentalists are amazing, but they never go overboard in this case. Do you share the same sentiments?
Yeah. Yes, I think even for a guy that is not into prog rock, I think this album is totally accessible, totally acceptable, for my taste, and for that reason I can praise it. And what's also interesting about Take a Pebble, there are only two tracks on this record that were both written and composed by Greg Lake. Take a Pebble and Lucky Man, and both of those tracks are, I think, one of my highlights. So he was definitely a very, very important part of this trio, right?
Yes, and I think what he brought to the band is this melodic sensibility. You know, he was very talented at writing what you would say, in this context at least, are pop tunes. You know, like Lucky Man is the pop song of this record, and it was a
Yeah,
huge
definitely.
hit.
It sounds like a definitely. I just wanted to say that it is kind of poppy, and it sounds like a typical '60s song with that singing. Do
Yeah,
you
like
have the same impression?
it's not even like you wouldn't, if it was on its own outside this record, you wouldn't even call it a prog rock song because it's like it's a very beautiful, short 60s kind of ballad. However, I find it very fascinating also because of the instrumental section near the end, the infamous Moog solo by Keith Emerson that was done in a single take. So that's the first take, and that ended up on the record. That wonderful solo, which has some kind of experimentation with pitch, right? He changes the pitch of the tones, and it sounds so awesome. I think people have been floored by that little solo since they first heard the track, and then music aficionados still talk about it. Very exciting. Another great thing about that track is that Greg Lake wrote the lyrics when he was 12 years old. So imagine. And I think the lyrics, while they do sound like something
Wow.
that was written by a young person, I think they sound excellent. especially within the context of the song, and it goes to show how talented this man was. Uh, quite a talent, both singing, playing, songwriting. He had it all. Even though, interestingly enough, he didn't really write a lot of lyrics for Emerson, Lake and Palmer. They had an external lyrics writer, Peter Seinfeld, and this guy wrote a lot of their tracks. So that's another interesting thing. But let's just mention other tracks here because I feel like this record is great throughout. There's not a single weak moment for me. So we had, as you said, the Barbarian. It's another interpretation of a classical music piece by Bela Bartok, a famous composer. And you know what I like about it is the way they synthesize classical music and rock. They make it so heavy, almost like heavy metal. There's like, and it also goes to show that you don't need prominent guitar to play heavy music. What did you think about that?
Totally agree. I think they, just like you said, heavy metal came slightly later, and that's why I thought that this track sounded ahead of its time. They just made it heavy, made it electric, and I think they did a good job.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And the Knife Edge is another similar track, albeit this one has lyrics, and it also sounds very dark, very sinister. Again, they incorporated a classical piece by Leos Janacek, a Czech composer. And I guess I can only imagine how classical musicians viewed this music at the time. They probably thought it was sacrilegious, but I feel it's a great take on classical music, adding all these heavy rock instruments. And the one thing that never ceases to fascinate me is how well Keith Emerson plays classical music and also jazzy stuff as well. He's so versatile, he's so diverse, and his playing is such a joy to listen to, especially on this record, which, while he does use organ and synthesizers at times, it's primarily dominated by piano, and I really love his piano playing. Also, The Three Fates is a great piece. And this is a classical piece, but it was written by Emerson himself, and it sounds like right on the money. A great piece, great keyboard work there. Just so much versatility in his playing. I can't praise him enough. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's I wanted to say at the beginning of discussing this band. I wanted to say that it's kind of mind blowing that these guys, this is actually a trio. There are so many layers and so many different sounds and so many contributions that you would say, oh, this is probably a big group. Everyone has something to add. No, this is basically three guys, and each of them had a lot to offer. That's my
Yeah, and I
general
mean,
take on the band.
and there's a lot of overdubs, right? Like you get occasional guitar playing by Greg Lake, which is so subtle and beautiful. And we will hear more of it on other records as well. Carl Palmer, he has his own piece that he wrote together with Emerson, Tank, where he shows his skills. It was his showpiece on this record, and many people don't like this track because they don't like drum solos, but I think it's really a thrill to listen to it as well. It kind of fits in with other stuff, and of course, as we said, the record ends with "Lucky Man," a great single, probably the tune that propelled them to stardom. Because these other tracks may not be as accessible to an average listener. So, Alex, is there anything you would like to add about this great debut record by Emerson, Lake and Palmer?
Finally, I would say that I really like the idea of incorporating these singles and pop songs. You have these long tracks that come from classical music that feature a lot of improvisation, and you just need to focus on it. They just also added this Lucky Man song, and that's the thing with the rest of the records that we're gonna discuss. So that's kind of it, and I would now like to give my rating and my favorite track. So there isn't just one standout track here, dear listeners, but I have to pick Take a Pebble. It's the second track, it's the longest track as well, but it offers a lot, so you won't waste your time listening to it. And the rating is, I think, 8 out of 10. So now I would like Vlada, you to tell us about your impressions.
Well, I will definitely rate it higher than that. I think this is one of the records that I love going back to. It's always been my favorite Emerson, Lake and Palmer record. It's just something majestic about it. I think every time I hear Keith Emerson play piano here, I just get floored. It's so masterful and yet so emotionally resonant. There, I use the phrase. And Take a Pebble is one of my all-time favorite tracks, so I will choose that as my highlight. Even though everything here is pretty amazing, I don't think this has a single weak moment, and I will give it 9.5 for that reason. I think that every fan of 70s rock music or 60s rock music should check out this record. It's a monumental piece of music, and it's one of the first times that classical music and rock music were so successfully blended together. I think this is an example of how you can break the limitations of the genre, extend your field of interest into other genres, incorporate them into a unique musical vision. And this is, I think, primarily due to Keith Emerson, who I feel is the true leader of the band. However, Greg Lake shouldn't be underestimated either with his songwriting, his hooks that he brings to the music that make the music instantly accessible. This is why they sold, I don't know, 48 millions of records, I think. And of course, Carl Palmer, one of the best drummers in rock music for sure. And when you hear his drumming here, you will know why. Everything is so precise here, and I think that it's definitely a record that you should check out. All right, so Alexander, now I have to tell you, it was hard to choose three records because, as I said, the early period was very fruitful. And there was another great record between this record and trilogy that we're going to talk about. This record is called Tarkus, and by many fans, it's considered to be the best record of the band. However, I decided to skip over it because, in my personal opinion, as great as that record is, I kind of prefer the record that we're going to talk about. So I wanted to talk about Trilogy mainly because it's sort of underrated. It's sandwiched between two monumental records by the band, Tarkus and Brain Salad Surgery, that we're going to talk about later on. So I wanted to give it some love and talk about it. So first, what did you think about this record? How does it compare to the first record? What do you think? How has the band progressed in the meantime?
Well, that's pretty surprising. I didn't know that this was an underrated record. So I think that this record is more accessible, and I just want to give a positive rating for that reason. Doesn't mean that it is necessarily a better record than the previous one that we discussed, but it is definitely more accessible, and I'm just really surprised that it didn't get that much love from the music fans. So the thing here is, a lot of tracks have this standard length. 4 minutes, 5 minutes. You have some longer tracks here and there, but it kind of sounds like a mainstream record. I don't want this to sound bad. It sounds like a good rock record, prog rock, that is. Again, you have a great opening track. It's called the Endless Enigma Part One. Great punchy track, and then all the other tracks are good as well, especially the instrumentals. That's what I also like about this band. It's the instrumentals. You have Hoedown, you have Eben's Bolero. Don't want to take anything away from the vocal part, but instrumentals are really special because, I, as a music fan, I am really into the instruments, the music. Sometimes it's more important to me than the singing. Obviously, it depends on the
Oh,
song,
that's
but
interesting given that you don't have much love for jazz.
well, maybe it's just maybe it's the question of time, and I have to say that you can hear some positive comments from me about this pen. So maybe just maybe we are slowly getting into this. We'll see. So okay, back to the record. Moving on, I think I also have to single out the sheriff. It sounded it sounded like another genre. I can't really recall. It's not easy to pick, but it sounded very experimental, and you can just see how diverse their ideas were. So the sheriff, Hoedown. Yeah,
Yeah,
wanted to say something, Vlada?
yeah, I wanted to say something about these songs that you mentioned, but first, um, I want to get back to the way the record starts with the Endless Enigma that you mentioned was a great track, and I absolutely agree. And it has so many different elements. Uh, it's one of the band's trademark songs, and for good reason. Kind of starts with this sort of avant-garde intro, very weird with piano, but it's at the same time very interesting. It really draws you in, and then it just kicks into this very catchy organ part. And once the vocal melody comes in, it's very dignified, very classical, sort of. So, such an epic song with so many elements, little things like at one point you hear the bells ring. Of course, there's a middle part which is called the fugue, and it's a great instrumental piece by Emerson. So, yeah, the record really starts on a high note, very diverse. Emerson is all over the place. A bit of piano, a bit of organ, a bit of synths. Everything adds so much color to the songs. But then you mentioned these songs like The Sheriff and Hold Down. And I need to say that I have somewhat mixed feelings about The Sheriff. And the thing about that song is that on almost every record from this period, including Tarkus and Brain Salad Surgery, the band includes one piece which is kind of whimsical and sort of sounds very, like wild, wild west music, western cowboy music. And The Sheriff is one of those songs, and it's probably
There you go. Yeah.
the best one at that. But what I don't like about it is that it sort of breaks the immersion from these grand pieces like the Endless Enigma that have this kind of uh, depth that only classical music can bring when it comes to instrumentation. If you heard some kind of thud in the background, that was my phone falling down. Yes, so I was
Yeah, yeah,
I
same
was a
here.
bit overexcited about this tune, so I started flailing with my hands. Yeah, a great piece that Endless Enigma is, and then when you have this middle with the sheriff, it kind of breaks the immersion. It just doesn't quite fit. Even though I have some good things to say about the song, um, it has a really cool organ work by Keith Emerson. Um, there's this little piano bit at the end that sounds like some kind of wild wild west saloon music, like if you ever watched western films, there's always this piano player in the saloon playing a particular type of music, and this sounds quite like that. So it's a fun track, but I don't know, it kind of breaks the immersion.
Would you say that it sticks out like a sore thumb?
No, not really, but it does stick out and not in a good way. Even though it's not a bad song, it just doesn't make sense to me. Hold Down is kind of similar, but it's a cover of Aaron Copland's track from the ballet called Rodeo. Um, and I don't know. This is also great instrumental workout, but it's very much similar to the Sheriff in tone. What I find fascinating about it is how the band plays in perfect unison. How Palmer follows Keith Emerson and Lake, and it's so precise. Again, I love how they play together. Their chemistry is second to none, in my opinion. So, but let's get back to other tracks that make this record great. What about From the Beginning? What did you think about that one?